If you would ever walk into a hospital today displaying flu-like symptoms, the nurses and the doctors will initially treat you like one who is already infected with the COVID-19 virus and put you on holding isolation until you are tested. Once the laboratory result comes out negative, that's the only time that they will look at other possible causes of your flu-like symptoms. Because of the current pandemic, doctors will likely look for the fewest possible cause to explain a patient's multiple symptoms and will initially choose the most likely cause for the symptoms. As they say among doctors, when it comes to medical diagnosis, common things are common. This approach is an application of what we know in philosophy as Occam's razor. This problem-solving principle states that the simplest explanation is preferable to the one that is more complex. When presented with different hypotheses or theories, the simplest explanation is usually the right one. Simpler in the sense that it has fewer assumptions to it. In other words, we should avoid looking for excessively complex solutions to a problem and focus more on what works given the circumstances or what is already known to you. The great physicist Albert Einstein is well known for restating this principle when he wrote, and I quote, "Everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler." But look at what has become of our life. I think we can all agree that life in general tends to complicate itself. We seem to move from a basic, monotonous life to a more diverse and sophisticated existence. We are proficient in multiplying our troubles and sorrow. We complicate our relationships. We make our economic situation more challenging. It seems that we cannot help it but make life more difficult than it is already. But don't get me wrong, complexity is not bad in itself. In fact, economists will tell you that complexity is necessary for economic progress and prosperity. Markets thrive in complexity, and potential financial gains are at the highest in complicated financial situations. But for the Christian life, or life in general, complexity is not only an annoyance, but also a fertile ground for confusion and frustration. More than that, our drift towards a complicated life speaks of our propensity for self-reliance and selfish independence. I would dare to say that a complicated life is in fact a disordered life, a tiring life that seems to be oblivious to what is truly important. I would like to remind us this morning that the Christian life is a lot simpler than we think. Christian spirituality operates on some basic principles. So if we are to live for God, or to live well for God in these complicated times, we need to revert to the basic principles of our relationship with God. And here's how I think it works. We can keep things simple by trusting God like a child. It's as simple as that. We are to reduce the complexity of our life by reverting to the simplest way that we relate to God, and that is trusting Him. So we are to keep things basic by trusting God like a child. I understand that the English slang basic is not exactly a favorable term. If they refer to you as a basic fellow or a basic individual, it means you're just one boring somebody who's not, people should not be impressed about, you know. Or if an event is described as basic, it's something that's mainstream, something that is common. But perhaps that's something that I would like to get at this morning. Because I think in order for us to resist or even step away from such a complicated life, a life that is just filled with the noise, the fretting, and the troubles that seem to dominate a modern day life, we are to go back to something as basic, as simple, as trusting God like a child. We can see that it is in going back to this basic idea of trusting God as a child that we are able to find our way and not only recognize our own limitations as human beings and discover the serenity and contentment in life that people are just dying to have in this world. Psalm 131 is a psalm that probably some of you have not even heard or read about. It's one of those neglected psalms because it's very short, just 3 verses. So we'll definitely finish early this morning. And you would notice that it's so simple in its message. That is why I think what it communicates to us is also something simple, a truth that is worth pondering upon, despite of what may appear to be a poem that is just so limited in terms of its scope or the verses that you would find in this particular chapter. Psalm 131 has only 3 verses, as I have said. It's fairly straightforward, but quite vivid in its emphasis. It is a testimony / prayer that ends with an exhortation. We know that this is a song of ascent. A song of ascent is one of those popular psalms that the pilgrims of Jerusalem would sing as they are approaching the city of Jerusalem. This one is attributed to David. Other than that, nothing is really said about this psalm. We know that it's a short psalm, but it expresses in eloquent terms what it's like to completely trust God, or what it's like to fully submit oneself to God's will. And at the end, it tells the congregation, or to whom the poet is writing, and says, you should also trust Yahweh completely as I did. Let me read that to you again. In verse 1, he writes, my heart is not proud, Lord. My eyes are not haughty. Those are parallel expressions. Proud heart, haughty eyes. I do not concern myself with great matters of things too wonderful for me. In contrast, verse 2, he says, but I have calm and quieted myself. So I have abandoned the things that he just mentioned, he said, and now I have arrived at this place where there is calmness, there's quietness. I am like a weaned child with its mother. And then he repeats that, like a weaned child, I am content. And then in verse 3, the exhortation, put your hope in the Lord, both now and forevermore. So easily you could discern that there is a statement of humility at the beginning, and there is a picture of what it's like to trust God in the second verse. And in the third verse, there is a call on the people, addressing the people this time, to hope in God. Let me go back to verse 1. He says, my heart is not proud, my eyes are not haughty, and I do not concern myself with great things. These are the 3 things that he's denying here. He's not saying that I'm proud, that I am not proud, or I am proud that I am not humble. That's not what it means. Of course, in a poetic way, what he's saying is, God, this is what I have been before you. So he's addressing this to God, and he's appealing to what God knows already about himself. He said, I've never been a proud person. I never had a proud heart. It's talking about the inner state of his being. You know, the heart really speaks of the center of a person's being in the Old Testament. So I have a proper view of myself. I'm not relying on myself. I do not see myself as self-sufficient. which is really what pride means. When we say in the biblical sense, when somebody is proud, this is somebody who is ignoring and neglecting the fact that he needs to depend on God. This is somebody who's saying, I can stand on my own. This is someone who says, I don't need anyone else to do what I want in life and accomplish anything in life. I am for myself, and everything else is for my own glory and for my own pleasure. That's what a proud person is. And he says, I'm not that. And then he goes on to say, I don't have haughty eyes. So literally, it means raised eyes. So pride is about, having a puff-up sense of self. Haughty eyes parallels that, but more on the idea that you are treating yourself as superior in comparison to the rest. This is a sense of arrogance, an overestimation of one's capability and importance. Especially when we look at the rest of the world and they are not as good as us, they are not as performing and as successful as us, we would say, hey, I'm better than all of you. So David says, I've never been that way. I've rejected the whole idea of feeling superior and in effect looking down on people and treating them not as or in the way that they should not be treated. Instead, he says, I've always looked at people as important in the same way that God looks at them. And then he proceeds to describe another thing that he would deny. He said he is unconcerned with great matters or things too wonderful for me. So this is an interesting point, I think, because here David is admitting his capacity or intellectual capacity in understanding or ascertaining the works of God. He is in fact saying that there's a lot of things that you are doing in the world, God, that are just really beyond my purview. I just can't fathom the depth of your knowledge and wisdom. I can't seem to make sense of the beginning and the end of your plan, God. Some of these things are just too much for me. I don't know if you ever had a chance at looking at a technical material, for example, which is totally outside your field. Like a doctor perhaps looking at electrical engineering articles, PhD thesis or dissertation, and you look at that and you're like, whew, it's just beyond my capacity. Right? I don't know if you've had that experience, but this is pretty much what's being portrayed here by David. When I look at what you are doing, God, the things that you say about yourself, your means and the mysteries that you are revealing to us, a lot of that just do not make any kind of sense to me. It's beyond my ability. That's just another way of saying that, God, I have come to terms with my own human limitations. And as a result, I know what it's like to be humble before you. And this is probably what we need to be looking at in our own life. Because some of us are still somehow caught up with this idealistic idea of who we are and what we are capable of. Oh, yes, you're young, that's true. Oh, yes, you're smart, that's true. Oh, you come from a nice family. Oh, you have the pedigree, you have the right training. You have all this wonderful experience. But once you start adding those things up and you end up with a conclusion that therefore, I can conquer the world, therefore, I don't need the aid of God, therefore, I don't need dependence of God, because I am what I am. I have what it takes. Isn't that what we are being told regularly to believe about ourselves? Isn't that exactly what culture promotes? That you got what it takes? You don't need anybody's help. You can make it on your own. You could strike gold on your own. There may be some truth to that. But when it comes, or when you view that in the context of your relationship with God, you would have to say, God, I am still human. God, I am not like you at all. Really, the first step is to say, you are not God. You are not God. And David has come to that conclusion when he looked at his own heart, his own attitude towards people, and his own experience with God. He says to himself, you are a lot greater than me, God. I am limited. I need you in my life. So that's what the first verse says. That humility is really the opposite of all of that. Proud heart, haughty eyes, and unconcerned with the great matters, as he mentioned. He realizes his dependence, and now he espouses a healthy view of himself. He now has a realistic understanding of his own capabilities and limitation. We've probably all heard it, but really the right stance, or the only stance that you can have before God, is that of humility. There is no other way that you can position yourself before the presence of God in any other position. Because when we are confronted with the majesty and the greatness of God, when that light is shown upon God, when we look at God in light of who we are, I hope what comes out immediately is the sense that we are really nothing. And therefore, there's nothing else that we can do before God but to humble ourselves. David said, I have come to terms with that reality. And in verse 2, he tells us the result of that. That's why there is a contrast here. But I have come and quieted myself, he says. This sense of humility, how I see myself in the presence of God, and my appreciation of who God is as my Creator God. This has brought a sense of calmness and quieted myself. Literally, it means to be still, to be motionless of some sort. And the second word, quieted, is to be silent. Just stilled and silenced, he says. But isn't that the exact opposite or the antonym of the adjectives that we use to describe modern day life? Frantic, noisy, restless, busybodies, here and there. And some of us, when pandemic came in and we have to do lockdowns, most of us we almost went crazy because we don't know what it's like to be stilled and quieted inside our homes. Or if you're a family man or you have kids in your family, it's probably the opposite, I should say. But we struggled with solitude and just being on our own and being by ourselves. But of course, David is describing something more of an inner state. Here he says, I have become quiet instead of turmoil and anxiety and restlessness and fear. I have arrived at a state of serenity, a state of peacefulness and contentment. One of the reasons why the New Age movement and the integration of Eastern religions and Christianity has become so popular, because people are really looking for peace, activities that would bring about a sense of peace, like contortion or twisting yourself or doing all those. I'm not making fun of, but doing all those positions supposed to empty your mind and give you a sense of peace of some sort. But maybe after a while, as soon as you leave that what do you call that gym, or as soon as you leave that temple, you go into the real world and the noise is back once again. But David says, I have arrived at this state of peace. So instead of self-fulfillment, which is what pride would cause us to do, instead of self-gratification, he has now rested in peace. Now, I'm sure you noticed that, because the only time we ever use that expression, rest in peace, is when people die. That's unfortunate, don't you think? Why would we wish a dead person to rest in peace? I never got that. Is it because they are caught up in some kind of a cycle and they're also troubled after they die, so that we only wish that we would have a peaceful rest? Isn't that what we say? May God rest his soul. I hope you don't get offended, but that's what my wish for you is today. That God would rest your soul. Of course, not in the way that we often use the term, but in the sense that you arrive at that state of serenity and peace in your heart. Instead of the frantic struggles that characterize the complicated life, may your soul be resting on God. I know, it's so sad that these expressions have been taken over by our culture and they only mean one thing in our culture, right? So let me redo that and sort of reuse that expression and say what we're talking about is really a state or an inner state, the condition of our heart, where we are no longer caught up with doing something for ourselves, striving for ourselves, but trusting and wholly depending on God. That's what David said. My soul is rested in God. My soul is at peace in God. And then he gives us this wonderful picture of a weaned child. He says, I am like a weaned child with its mother. Then he repeats this, like a weaned child, I am content. It's very touching that he would bring up a very, very common picture. You know, we have 3 daughters, and some of you have kids. And you know what it's like to have a suckling or an infant who's dependent on milk, and how they can be restless and anxious at times. Of course, they cannot talk yet, so all they do is cry to signal to you that they're hungry, or do all kinds of sounds that's supposed to alert you that they need to be cared for. But that's all they do. They're so helpless. And at times, and one of the things that you have to learn as a parent is not only to read those signals, but to learn to be patient with them. Right? Isn't that what they say, that these are the terrible truths when they're trying to be independent. At the same time, they all need the care that they need. You cannot just leave them alone. They're going to go their way and do whatever they want, right? And then, at least in the ancient times, they wean them up at around 3 years old. I mean, in modern times, we start feeding them solid food after 1 year. Isn't that the case? And we start introducing them to food other than milk. So what he's saying here is just like a weaned child, this state of quietness that he was talking about, is picture that to be that of a weaned child who at this point has already advanced in the developmental stage. He doesn't crave for milk anymore, still drinks milk, of course, but he has been introduced to normal, regular food, and now he's probably eating with the rest of the family, on the schedule that the family has. Because when you're an infant, you don't eat 3 times a day. You drink, when you're hungry. I was going to say, isn't that what your experience was like? No, you don't remember, of course. But when they cry, you feed them, like every 2-3 hours, depending on how old they are. But when they are weaned off their milk, they eat just like the rest of the family members. And here, the picture of that is that of a child who is weaned and who is now sitting at the lap of his mother, fully satisfied and well fed. So David says, I have arrived at that state. I'm not frantic. I'm not anxious. I'm not overly concerned about the things that I cannot control. I'm not compelled to fix the things that I cannot fix. I'm not driven by ambition. I'm not wanting more in this life. I'm not adding more complications to my life, but I have learned to be just like a child, trusting God every day. If you're a parent, you know how trusting kids can be. If you promise them something, they're going to make sure you're going to do it, or you're going to give it to them. And they have no concept of waiting. You have to tell them what WAIT is all about. Waiting for them, especially kids nowadays, is about 2.5 seconds. And they would come back and say, give it to me, go do this. Please give this to me, go do this. Over and over again. But David says, I'm past that. I'm not going with the flow as everybody else's is. I'm not running with the crowd. I'm not joining the competition anymore. I have already stepped out of that race, this rat race that they call life in this world. But I have learned to sit down at my mother's lap and be content and happy about it. My soul is weaned like a child. And we know that he got here after he has learned humility and acceptance and have come to terms with himself. So now he's not disturbed with the storms of passions that rages in the hearts of many. He is no longer driven by the waves of confusion and all that. He sits there, weaned off from all of that. You should probably see by now that much of the things that brings complication to our day-to-day existence are things that we ourselves have allowed to become part of our life. I always think of life as something, of course, the Bible says we were born naked. We did not bring anything in this world. But isn't that how development happens for all of us? We come out of school, we get into our professional life, we find a job, we start earning money, and we're happy with that. We get a few extra, we try to enjoy the finer things of life. And then that's not enough for us. We want complication, we get married. Right? And of course, we think that's not even enough. We have more kids and more of them, just so it will become more challenging for us. We get into debt. We buy a house. We buy a car. We travel just like everybody else's. We desire, we ambition the finer things for our family. And the next thing we know, we wake up overwhelmed by everything that we have added to our life. That doesn't even include the things that people added into our life and the problems that they brought into our life. I'm just talking about the things that we ourselves have brought into our own life. And with the complications comes the confusion. With the complication comes the disordered life. With the complication comes the mispriorities. With the complications comes frustrations and tiredness. And then life becomes not as enjoyable as it used to be. David wants us to see that the way that we can resist and even try to work our way out of such a complicated life is to go back to something as basic as trusting God like a child. The problem is, as we get older, it becomes a lot harder to picture ourselves as that of a child trusting God. Because when you're a child, you're naive. When you're a child, you don't know the complications about your decisions. You know, when you tell a child, for example, one of your son or daughters try this, you know, if they say something like, oh, we need to buy this, or we need to go there, and you tell them, we don't have resources, we don't have money, all that they would tell you is, why don't you pray? It's that simple. There's no complications in their mind because they know that when you pray, God would answer and provide you the money that you need. But no, we resist that. That's very simplistic, isn't it? We know that it's a lot more complicated, and you tell your children, there's a lot more going on than just simply praying to God and God sending money. Although God can do that, but there is such thing as a job. And the job is supposed to pay you money, and that money should be enough to cover, I hope, everything that you need in your family. So we demur from the idea that we need to trust God like a child because our own adult experience seems to contradict that. Or maybe because our thinking has become so complicated when it comes to these matters. So David wants us to see that we need to keep things basic and trust God like a child. Verse 3 says, Israel, calling on the nation and the fellow worshipers, put your hope in the Lord, both now and forevermore. This is not only for the original addressee, but this is for everybody who reads this psalm, and this is for you and me this morning. What David experienced for himself, he knows that it's something that we ourselves can experience when we do as he did in this case. It's a straightforward application. He wants us to be humble before God, resist pride, arrogance, self-independence, self-reliance, and an overestimation of the self, and come to terms with who you are before God. Accept your limitations and acknowledge your dependence on God. And it tells us that as a result of that, you can become quiet, even as you nurture your faith and as you build your confidence in God. You will feel this sense of serenity that he himself has discovered. So the ending of the psalm is a call on each one of you this morning. A call and an offer from God in order for us to experience what it's like to be at peace in the midst of all the troubles that the world is in today. We have to learn to trust God like a child.